I generally know, for example, a lot of people have objections to various parts of the talks from Maharshi because they say they've been improperly translated or improperly transcribed. But one of the texts that supposedly Maharshi edited, very carefully was Guru Vachaka Kovai. So we can take it to be, a fairly authoritative statement of his views. And it's a very long text, so many hundreds of verses, paragraphs, you could say, are there. So I'm going to be covering just some excerpts from there. And these excerpts are paragraphs that I found interesting, striking, and useful for conveying what I think are the most important parts of the spiritual search, and maybe certain topics that are intriguing, have been come at it from an intriguing angle. So I'm going to talk about different pieces of the text, comment on them, and any of you should feel free to ask questions at any time, because I'm sure they'll come up, so we can make it a kind of discussion. So I'm going to start with the 19th paragraph, which is sort of after the preliminaries, the sort of preliminary pieces have been made, praising Ramana Maharshi. So this paragraph reads in English, as cause alone is seen as its effect, and since consciousness, or Brahman, which is the cause, is as clearly true as an amalaka fruit on one's palm, this vast universe, its effect, which is described in the scriptures as mere names and forms, may also be called true. So I had to look up at one point what an amalaka fruit was, because I'm not actually familiar, but it's basically a fruit. Maharishi uses this analogy that when the self shines, it's going to be blindingly obvious that it is shining. There'll be no doubt about it. Basically, it'll be as clear as a fruit in the palm of your hand is the point. And what he's saying in this paragraph basically is, there's a long-standing tradition in Hindu philosophy that effects are really nothing but their causes, and so we can view this world as being an effect of the self. We could view it that way. And to the extent that we view it that way, we are viewing this as nothing but an expression of the self. And to that extent, if we view it that way, we could say, he says, that the world is real, if we consider it to be self. And I'm going to show you in just a second how this is, it's a very kind of, how should I put it? It's a way of angling the mind in a certain way, because he wants to say, okay, yeah, sure, this world is real if you consider it to be the self, but what does that really mean to consider the world as self? Does it mean that we really consider it as the world? And he kind of shows this tension in the next little excerpt, which I'm going to read, and I just want to show you, because a lot of the way that Vedanta has to be taught, because we are approaching a subject which is ultimately trying to break you out of a conceptual prison, is things are said that contain within them certain seeming contradictions. And then it's like opening a box, and then within that box is another box, and then within that box is another box, and on it goes. It doesn't want you to stop the thought process at any sort of fixed concept. It wants to break you through a series of concepts. And so I'll show you that, for example, in verse 23, for example, he says, the realized who do not know anything as being other than self, which is absolute consciousness, will not say that the world, which has no existence in the view of Supreme Brahman, is real. Now you see, it sounds like it's a little bit in tension with what I just read a moment ago. It's not really in tension. it's actually the underlying meaning of it. If you view the world as nothing but absolute consciousness, in a sense, you're not viewing the world at all. If you view the world as nothing but absolute consciousness, say the world is real as absolute consciousness being self, being something which is beyond the mind, beyond concepts, beyond forms. What in effect you're saying in some sense is the world doesn't exist. That's what it means. That's what it means. So first, you're sort of brought along this sort of path by saying, yeah, the world is real, but it's real as the self. When you break down what that means, in some deeper way, we're saying the world is very unreal. Even that's problematic, actually. Well, every view is problematic. This is part of the theme I want to say about these paragraphs. Every view is problematic. Every view contains within it a kind of internal contradiction, and that's because the real truth of Advaita is not in any proposition about what is the case. Even the greatest things that are said about the self and Brahman, for example. I'm just giving an example. Brahman, the self, is Satchidananda, being, awareness, bliss. But it's also said in the Upanishads that Brahman is Nedi, meaning indescribable. Well, so which is it? Right? And it's clearly said. There's all kinds of fun contradictions, but the contradictions are meaningful. They're meaningful contradictions. They're deliberate contradictions. It's said that those who speak of Brahman do not know. Those who know of Brahman do not speak. But this is a text. This itself is in an Upanishad, which is a text speaking about Brahman. Right? So what it's trying to show you is there's something outside of our ability to fully capture it. We're trying to show you that yes, there's something here which you can't fix it. You see, if you say it's one thing, then you have to acknowledge it's also the other thing. And if it's that thing, then it's the third thing, and the third thing, and the fourth thing. And these things seemingly contradict each other because what we're talking about is something which is outside of our usual ability to imagine anything. So how do you break out of the conceptual prison? That's basically what Vedanta is about. And that's what these statements are ultimately about. The logical chain they lead you through is one which ultimately breaks the mind. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. So a third verse on essentially the same point. In verse 100, he says, although Guru Ramana taught various doctrines according to the level of understanding of those who came to him, we heard from him that Ajata alone is truly his own experience. Thus should you know. So a couple of things are said here. So one is he taught various doctrines. This makes sense. There are various doctrines about how this world of seemingly different objects is related to the self, which is in Advaita, one without a second. So one without a second cannot have differences in it. It has to be one without a second. And yet there seem to be differences. So there are various kinds of explanations, that could be given. And, I forget the exact Sanskrit terms, Shrishti, Drishti, and Drishti, Shrishti, and all these different kinds of relationships that are given. You could, for example, say, like in that very first verse I read, that this is in fact a kind of effect or creation of God or of the self, right? There's various views of it. So the deepest underlying truth is all the views are ultimately imperfect and wrong. That's why they're different views. None of the views are exactly correct. We're trying to get beyond views. That said, you see, he mentions Ajata. Ajata is a term that means unborn, and it's used in the Mandukya Upanishad, or the Mandukya Karaka, I think, which, commentary of Gaudapada. So the idea of the world being unborn is getting at the same point as saying that if you consider the world to be nothing but the self, in some sense it doesn't exist. See, I think I was commenting on this yesterday. If there are things, if there are events, then you have inevitable questions about why those things are the way they are. Is it karma? Is it God's will? Is it scientifically explicable? There are many, many different ways of looking at explanations, and all of them fall short in various ways. Why is there injustice? Why is there evil? I mean, go on and on and on, right? And again, people try to justify, people try to explain, but there are problems with all these explanations. Ajata means, effectively, things have not come into existence, right? Because only if things come into existence can we talk about them as things and then ask, why are they the way they are? Why are they the way they are? If they have not come into existence, that question can't arise. Does this mean then we could ask that there are no things? Not exactly, not exactly. See, there are no things is yet another view. It's itself a statement made really of things in a way. What Ajata is trying to point to is there is a truth, which when you investigate it, unravels the one who says, the one who could say that there either are or are not things.
In Shushupti, nothing exists. Deep sleep, right?
Yeah, right. So in deep sleep, theoretically, you might say nothing exists. But that's not exactly what Ajata is saying. Ajata is saying the one who would proclaim that either something or nothing exists is the root of the different views. Is the root of the different views. Is the root, and when you say different views, we mean the different ways of classifying, the world. See, only when you cut up the world into objects do you have the notions of things coming into existence, things going out of existence. The one who classifies is I. Only when you have I, then you have not I, and then the not I is split up into pieces. Those things become the way that we view the world. Ajata is saying that whole way of looking at things is in some profound sense inaccurate. Because in order for there to be things in the first place, there has to be that initial division between what seems to be a solid central I and everything else. Based on that initial division between I and not I, you get all the things. And from all the things, you get name and form, you get language, you get concept, and then you get creation and destruction, you get time and space, you get duration, all of these things. That's all premised on there being an initial boundary which says there's a difference between me and everything that's not me. If that initial boundary does not exist in the way that it seems to exist, then all the differentiations that we then create can't be what they seem to be. Does that make any sense?
But how we can correlate when we think that pure consciousness is neither cause nor effect?
Yeah, well, what it means for it to be not cause nor effect is effectively the same thing as what Ajata is saying, which is that there is the very notion of cause and effect is rooted in a view of reality that's false. All views of reality in that sense are coming out of language, and all language is rooted in the initial distinction between me and not me. If you undermine that initial distinction, like dominoes, everything else falls. And what we are left with is a profound inability to say anything, because all saying is dependent on that initial distinction. So that inability to say means we cannot say that there is nothing. That's also a saying. We cannot say there's nothing. We cannot say there's something. We cannot say, we cannot say, we cannot even say that we cannot say. This dilemma is the truth. And that even, so you can see, as soon as you talk about it, it becomes this kind of self-destroying language. That's what Ajata is pointing to, that that the distinctions that we draw are fundamentally false in some profound way. They're so false, you can't even call them false, because even the words true and false are themselves distinctions of that type. That's what's going on. So we're left with something like a kind of awe, you might say. Like, yeah, see, it's not exactly flux, it's the unspeakable is what it is. It's the unspeakable. It's so unspeakable that the unspeakable runs through speech. Speech itself is nothing but the unspeakable. This is what's happening. We can't say this or that. But then we are saying, see, the problem is even saying that is saying this or that. You see how this is a problem, right? Even saying we can't say it, we're saying it. So what does that mean? It means that there's something that can't be said. We can't even say that it can't be said. This is something like, it's trying to point to the root of the mind. The root of the mind is based in something which, when examined, turns out not to be what it seemed to be. And if that root is not what it seems to be, then everything built on top of it, which is all our thinking, all our conceptions, including the very idea that there is anything at all, are all built on that. Which is not to say that there's nothing. Remember, it's not the same as saying there's nothing. It's saying that saying there's something and saying there's nothing are both thoughts. And there's something profoundly flawed with all thought, basically. All thought is starting on a basis that is profoundly flawed. That's what Ajata is referring to. Because if you really examine it, our concepts, our I falls, or in a way it falls. The I, which we start with, is not what it seems to be. Therefore, our concepts are not what they seem to be. And therefore, we ultimately cannot say that anything comes into existence. We cannot say that anything is happening. Because people want to say, oh yeah, even something like there is pure consciousness, but things still go on. Who's saying that? Good question. Any statement that can be made whatsoever is ultimately rooted in this problem, the problem of the I. And so when if we look deeply into that, we are unmoored, we are uprooted, we lose the ability to make those distinctions, take them serious. There's something very, very profoundly mysterious, and yet very intimate that's running through everything.
Won't we say it exists? When the world wakes up, or I wake up, right? The Hankara which comes on top of it, right? Ahankara, which is
Yes, yes, yeah. So that's exactly my point. So there's, Vedanta moves through different views. It's like rungs of a ladder. It takes you from where you are, and then it moves you up from view to view to view, right? So you could start with saying, yeah, sure, it seems like the world exists, just like it seems you exist, let's investigate that further. The end of this process of investigation will be that it will not be possible to say that I exist in the way that I thought I did. It will not be possible to say anything, in fact. And that includes, therefore, that there is a waking up, that there are objects, there are people. At the same time, how should I put this? It can be spoken of because the speaking itself is not speaking. There's a what it means to say something, the meaning of that is itself in some should I put this? It becomes plunged in mystery, basically. Because we don't want to say that words are somehow themselves forbidden or anything like that. Words are not forbidden. The underlying meaning of the words, however, is not what it seems to be. It's like in a dream, for example, if you're in a dream, you have the idea of between thinking and perceiving, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm not thinking right now. This is just raw seeing or raw hearing. There's no thought involved. But the moment you see something, there is an invisible thought that's already infused it. In order to see, underlying thought already has classified it in a way. That's why you have an organized sense of perception. That's why it seems as if things happen. That's why there's an underlying base. There's a base I thought. The base I thought is organizing your experience so that it seems as if things are orderly in a way. But things are not orderly in the way that they seem to be. They may be orderly in a different way, but they're not orderly in the way that they seem. So, yes, okay. So I think this is enough said about this for the moment. You can ask questions, obviously, as they come up. But what I want to point out here is the reality of the world is something which can be seen from different perspectives. You could kind of consider it real in a sense, provisionally real. You could consider it God's creation in a way. You could consider it unreal, and you can consider it really unspeakable, what its reality status is. All of these views are true. All of these views are false. Some of these views are closer to the absolute truth than others. And this is a method of thinking that ultimately is trying to break you of your views entirely, in some sense. Ultimately, the greatest view is getting out of the usual viewpoint entirely, out of the usual series of viewpoints. And that's really what all the ultimate statements are pointing to. When they point, they have certain internal contradictions for the purpose of breaking your usual way of thinking. Okay. Feel free, by that, as I said, any time to ask questions as they occur. But all right. So the next verse I've chosen verse 110. If one inquires to the very end, Who is this Jiva, I? It will be found that he is non-existent, and Shiva will be revealed as nothing but the supreme expanse of consciousness. Thus, when the Jiva, the seer, who with great desire saw this world, has disappeared, it is ridiculous to attribute reality to the world as seen. Again, on the same theme. So the idea that there is a real world at all is entirely based on the implicit reality of the seer. So people ask exactly like, I think someone asked yesterday, right? Yeah, but aren't there duties that have to be performed? Doesn't life have to go on, et cetera, et cetera. This is all based on the idea that, yeah. Spiritual is all that, is fine, but there's real life, isn't there? That view is held because it seems undoubtable that I am the witness at a minimum. I'm witnessing this. And it's true, that's where we start an inquiry actually. But that is not what it seems to be. That is the ultimate truth of Vedanta. The seer is not the seer in the way that it seems to be, and therefore the scene is not what it seems to be either. So that's what the meaning of illusion is. There is a profound illusion, even behind the most elementary statements you could make, like that I'm seeing it all. That statement is rooted in the egoic illusion.
So that brings a question, like now in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that the seer has to perform duties, correct? Irrespective of his existence, So he prescribed we need to do the duties in the illusionary world, what you are saying now.
So, right. So the question is, to whom is that addressed and to what purpose?
Yeah.
So it said, I don't forget where I just read this, but maybe in Guru Vachaka Kovai itself, but some verse that I didn't select, that is said so that people who are maybe not fully dedicated to the path, basically, are not misled, but that actually, I think Maharshi says this later in Guru Vachaka Kovai, that actually there are no duties for jnanis. The truth is, how could there be duties for the self? It doesn't make any sense. You see, that different things are said in the Bhagavad Gita, and in fact in all the scriptures, to suit the level of the listener. That's exactly what even these views I was just talking about are. There are different views that seem to be contradicting each other. Why? Because they speak to where a particular person is. A certain view will resonate with them. Another view will be like gibberish, basically. So that doesn't mean that the view that's given is ultimate reality. It means that a certain thing is said to a certain listener who at a certain stage in their seeking, that's all they can understand. And that's good for them at that particular moment. But the closer we get to ultimate truth, the more of those distinctions have to be discarded. Because the reality is, the self is actionless. The self is incapable of acting, in fact. Action is a thought. It's an illusion. So what would it mean to say, yes, you have to do something? Who has to do what? That's the question. The very notions of action and inaction in the first place are themselves rooted in ignorance, basically. They're rooted in the original belief that I am separate somehow. I'm separate from everything else. Only a separate person can imagine that they have the ability to act independently. But in fact, nobody's independent in that way. Verse 111 says, after the above two prime entities, world and jiva, have disappeared, that which alone remains shining is Shiva, i.e. self. But although this is the absolute truth, how can the already dead jiva think of it as being non-dual? So what this is showing is, right, so we have this sense of I. We, through inquiry or surrender, we try to deeply investigate the sense of I. In the process of this deep investigation, the attachments weaken, and eventually if the attachments weaken sufficiently and the intensity, therefore, of the search becomes powerful enough, the desire for liberation becomes powerful enough, then the illusion is penetrated. And in that illusion, the penetration of that illusion, so to say, you could say that the jiva, or that, the individual person, quote unquote, dies. And therefore, what this verse is saying is, who's left to say to call reality non-dual? Non-dual is another, it could become another view. It could become like another static, fixed position. And we're trying to get away from fixed positions. Ultimately, we cannot say what reality is. We are reality, but we cannot say what it is. And so even Advaita, as a view, to the extent that it's a view, has to be discarded in the end. In the end, all views have to be discarded in the end. So that's really what it's pointing to. The truth is neither dual nor non-dual. That's what non-dual means, actually, right? Non-dual means it can't be classified. It can't be classified as one thing or another. It's not, not only at one level is non-dual opposed to dual. That is at one level. But at a deeper level, what it's really saying is both non-duality and duality are themselves just ideas. And no idea is exactly correct. That's what it's ultimately trying to point to. Any questions so far on Zoom? Okay, I'll keep going. Verse 120. That which shines in the heart of an earnest aspirant as the supreme reality is mere jnana itself. Why, therefore, after the annihilation of the ego, point out this one is a great jnani and that one is another? Are they merely the bodies? So this brings again into our discussion the problem with the concept of a jnani. See, what happens is, and this is necessary, right? There are certain necessary illusions. Right? That's why Vedanta is so beautiful, and that it gives you different views. That, like I say, it rungs on a ladder. It takes you one way, and then it says, nope, turn this way, and then nope, turn that way. Because only by giving you certain enticements can it move you in the right direction from where you currently are. People imagine that when self-realization happens, that effectively they'll become like some kind of super person. Because that's what the mind can imagine. The mind imagines that they're going to be there, that you're going to be there in some altered form, right? And then obviously the mind assumes that about various teachers, including Maharshi and so on, right? That they had some extraordinary status that other people didn't. And in some ways you can say that's true, but at a deeper level, which is in terms of liberation itself, it cannot be the case that you really have a person who's a jnani. It doesn't make any sense really at the deepest level, because jnana is non-identification with the person. Not means I'm not the person. I'm not the person. I'll give you an example. I really like this example. It's illustrative of a lot of things. But imagine, for example, you're reading a book. You're reading a book, a novel. And the novel is written in the first person, right? So it uses the word I. So you're reading this novel, I went to the grocery store. Does anyone go to the grocery store? Nobody goes to the grocery store. Right? You read the words, I went to the grocery store. Nobody went to the grocery store. You're just reading it in a novel. It's just letters. It's just letters. You see that? It's just letters. And if it says later, I was stopped in traffic and I got angry, did anyone get angry? Nobody got angry. Nobody got angry. And then later it says, I went on a spiritual quest. Nobody went on a spiritual quest. And later it says, I practiced a lot of sadhana and I realized that I'm actually just a character in a novel. Nobody had that realization. What happens is there's a reader, and the reader looks at these letters on a page and imagines a hypothetical person who is said to have these experiences. There's no actual person having these experiences. It's a hypothetical person. It's a hypothetical person. So the hypothetical person written about in the book, imagined by the reader, who realizes, quote unquote, that they're just a character in the book, and therefore they're so-called jnani. It's a hypothetical person. It's not a real person. It's not a real person who had the problem, and it's not a real person who had the solution. This is an imaginary person the whole way through, meaning not a person at all. Just an idea, actually, really. And if we want to complicate the situation, I would say the reader themselves is a character in a second book. That second book has a second reader. That second reader is a character in a third book. This is how it goes, because we don't want to stop it. We don't want to say, oh, the reader is real. If we have categories, they have to go deeper and deeper and deeper forever. But my point here is, anyway, is there are certain profound problems with the concept of a jnani, and we should just keep that in mind. Now, many things have to be borne in mind simultaneously. On the one hand, you are seeking jnana, you are seeking liberation. On the other hand, you're already liberated, and there could be no such thing as a jnani. So try to maintain both these seemingly contradictory ideas in mind simultaneously.
In that case, from there, the non-existence of jnani is there.
Yeah.
Then what we are seeking the liberation from?
No, exactly. So the issue is, it cannot simply be the case that there's no such thing as jnana or jnanis. That is one facet of the truth, you might say. But there's another facet, which is, right now it feels like I'm suffering. Right now it feels like I'm trapped in my body. It feels like I have to do things. I feel like pain and suffering and effort and all of these kinds of things. And I want out of that, or I want truth, with a capital T. So on the one hand, we have this notion that that we're given through the scriptures that you're already that. But on the other hand, you also have this notion that, but I'm still feel like I'm suffering. Both have to be maintained in mind. So it's not the case that one is to negate the other completely. You have to see, okay, I feel like I'm suffering. Well, who am I that seems to be suffering? Keeping in mind that this is going to ultimately reveal to you the truth of that second statement. In fact, nobody's suffering. Suffering is imaginary.
Yeah, that's exactly my question. Then,
so
from what we are trying to get the liberation from, then my I self is like.
In the end, nobody's trying to get liberation.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. See, the very quest for liberation is also fictional. The delusion, there's no ignorance. There's no ignorance in the end. I mean, that would be the closest thing to the truth. There's no ignorance, there's no search, and there's no finding. Ramana says this.
So there is a comment here when you see from Das, when you see a jnani and feel unified with the jnani, at that moment there are no two people, jnani and you. Your thoughts are destroyed at that moment.
Yeah, no, I mean that experience can happen. Sure. So, there certainly are experiences of peace that can be had. And, I'm not saying that different people don't give off different vibrations, and that can be helpful for a seeker, certainly. My point is simply that we can't imagine that really speaks of a difference in final truth. In final truth, Maharshi said, in as much as I have something special, everybody has it. That has to be the case, actually. If it weren't the case, then jnana would be an object. But it seems to be an object. See, at the same time, I want to say similarly, and yet it seems to be. And we have to pursue it in a way as if it were. We can't simply say, oh, I'm already that, and therefore I'm not going to put in any effort. Because unfortunately, we're trapped in a seriously problematic set of mental habits. Those mental habits have to be eroded. At the end of that erosion, it will then be the case that it'll become apparent that those mental habits were never a problem to begin with. They never a problem, and nor did anyone exert any effort to remove them either, by the way. Go ahead.
It's like a person who has not learned how to read, and you give him the book. It's not going to make any sense to him.
Sure.
Or he doesn't know how to read.
Sure, exactly.
Same thing if a nanny came right in front of you, if you are not evolved to his level, you're not going to recognize that he is a nanny.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. But what I'm trying to say here. So yeah, there is a sense of not being able to recognize certain people, who are evolved, if you're not evolved enough to that point, perhaps, right? But what I'm trying to say is, at the deepest level of truth, one should recognize that the notion of a jnani has serious contradictions built into it. Because jnana means I'm not a person. So how could there be a jnani? A jnani is attributing, this is what Maharshi is saying in this verse. A jnani is saying, this body is enlightened. But enlightenment means I'm not the body. I am not the body. That's what it means. That is the recognition. I am not the body. I'm not the mind. I am not anything conditioned. So therefore, how can we attribute that knowledge, which says I'm not a person, to a person?
Mm-hmm.
There's a serious problem with that. So yeah. So just to keep that in mind, that's all.
There's some other chat message from Sheila Kumar.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than saying there is no suffering, would it be that the individual seems to think there is an experience, pain, happy or sad, as if in a dream, rather? Sure.
I mean, you can say that, absolutely. So, you can say it as if in a dream. But I will just say that when you say it's as if it's in a dream, that is, one of the many views that hopefully will motivate you to look into who it is that is supposedly dreaming this dream. And if you do look into who is supposedly dreaming this dream of suffering, the end result will be to realize no one was ever dreaming this dream of suffering. And we call that recognition waking up. So there's something which is, very, very, that's why Maya is magic. There's something very magical about this process, because when you look into it, it not only disappears, it never was the case. It's not as if there was something and then it's gone now. It's that there never was that thing to begin with. How can that be? Well, you have to look for yourself and see. That's the nature of the illusion. Very strange. Very, very strange.
121. The verse 121 is what exactly you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, I'm not sure I have it. I think I only have the excerpts for it. Oh no, I do have it actually. Yeah, verse 121 says, "With great eagerness and wonder." Is that one? That one, right?
Yeah.
What you fly to see one Mahatma there.
If you look inside, all Mahatmas are.
Yeah. All the Mahatmas are there. Exactly. That's right. Exactly. Precisely. That's the ultimate. Obviously, the ultimate guru is the self. If it weren't the case that it was already known, it wouldn't be knowable. That's the truth. Verse 149. The experience of Vedanta is possible only for those who have completely given up all desires. For the desirous, it is far away, and they should therefore try to rid themselves of all of their desires by the desire for God, who is free from desires. So the way I read this is the basic need for sadhana. Because what happens is the attachments, which are the desires, crowd in, and we have a couple of things that kind of again reinforce each other. One is the identification as a person. And as a result of that identification as a person who has certain relationships and a past and a future and all of that, we have desires and fears and so on and so forth, things we care about. And as we pursue those things that we care about and try to avoid the things we don't want, the mind moves. And in that movement, it obscures what you really are. And in that movement, it reinforces your sense of being a separate person. And in that reinforcement of being a separate person, the desires and fears are also reinforced. And it's kind of like a cycle that way, a kind of vicious cycle that way. What has to happen is you need to plant a different desire, you cannot escape that directly. You have to plant a different desire, a single desire. That desire is the desire for God or the desire for liberation, which is really the same thing. And that desire has to be grown. And that desire will then suck up all the power from the other desires eventually. Because as you pursue the desire for God through the practices, you will experience more peace. And eventually that the peace that you experience through that pursuit will make the other desires and fears less compelling. And in making them less compelling, they also make your identification as a person more and more like thin. They thin that identification. But it feels less and less the case that I care about this person. Because what it is to be a person is to have all these desires and fears and have the mind moving constantly between them. So when you slow the motion of the mind, you experience more peace, you weaken the attachments, you weaken the identification with the body and the mind, and that's all by virtue of the desire for God or for liberation being strengthened more and more and more and more and more.
Dharana.
And sorry.
Dharana.
Yeah, it is a kind of dharana. It is a kind of concentration. That concentration becomes like goes from a spark to a bonfire, and that bonfire then consumes, in some sense, everything else, right? So, when the profound intensity is there, that I really want this more than anything else, then clarity will shine at that point, and that will come automatically through the practice. Eventually, that practice that practice, which is itself a function of grace, will lead to further grace. Verse 150, the wise who know that all worldly experiences are formed by prarabdha alone never worry about their life's requirements. Know that all one's requirements will be thrust upon one by prarabdha, whether one wills them or not. Very important, because this is, of course, a huge fear that people have. Like, if I pursue spirituality, my entire life is going to go into the dustbin. And the reality is, whatever you need will be provided for you. Whatever you need may not be what you think you need. But whatever you need, whatever you're fated to have by prarabdha, meaning the karma that you're coming into this life with, is going to happen whether you like it or not. That's a way, I will say, again, this is an example of what I would call like a provisional view. Because the reality is, in the end, does karma exist? Does karma not exist? Karma is a view. Karma is just a view. And views are all unreal. So that means karma is in the end unreal. But for our purposes, for someone who cares and is worrying about what's going to happen, you should know that what is going to happen, it's useful for the seeker. It's useful for the seeker to keep the view that what is going to happen is fated to happen already, whether you like it or not. And that includes the necessities of life that you will be given. What you need, you'll be given. What you need, you'll be given. Whatever you get is what you need. And this is said multiple places, by the way. This is said in multiple places, not just Maharshi. It's said in the Gita that one who dedicates themselves to God, their necessities will be provided for. It's said in the Bible. Jesus says in the New Testament, he says, look at the way that God, clothes the flowers in the fields, lilies in the fields. He says they're better dressed than the courtiers at Solomon's court. Look at the way that he provides for the birds in the sky. Every creature is provided for. If they're provided for, how much more worthwhile are you as a human being? So ye of little faith, basically, just relax. You do not need to toil. You do not need to toil for life's necessities, they will come to you automatically. Whatever is needed will come to you. Whatever is needed will come to you. So yeah, that's it's a very useful view to keep if you are in a spiritual search. Don't worry about what's going to happen. Don't worry about what's going to happen. Don't worry about getting what you need to get. It will come. Whatever you need will come, whatever that is.
Yeah, there is a question from Sheila Kumar.
Huh?
Although Jiva knows there is no free will, why does Jiva still think it wants liberation?
Yeah, because yeah, that's a good question. So it doesn't really know that there's no free will. See, because the idea that there's no free will is just an idea. And the real truth is, it's not exactly the case that there either is or there is not free will. Free will, non-free will, free will, destiny are both, again, views. They're both ideas. Both ideas are not quite right. It's very useful for a seeker to think basically there's no free will, but we should make an exception for liberation. So we should say, even though it seems contradictory, yes, there is free will to pursue this. There is free will to turn away from the usual ways of acting. So in a way, it's not sufficient to have just the idea that I don't have any free will, because unfortunately, it's our seeming experience that we do. As long as that experience is there, that means the illusion is in effect. As long as the illusion is in effect, we then have to use what free will that we seemingly have, even if we know theoretically this is just an illusion. It's not sufficient to know that theoretically. That's just an adjunct, it's a stepping stone, it's an aid. You have to know it directly. What that means is you have to use your so-called seeming free will that you seem to have towards the spiritual search. And knowing that, everything else is fated to happen. You can use your intellectual understanding to help you essentially be less attached to everything else. But it's insufficient to think that just the concept that I don't have free will is the same as direct knowledge of the truth. It is not the same thing. All these philosophical views are meant to be basically like motivational. How can we help the seeker be motivated to turn away from their usual pursuits and look inward in a more consistent way? That's basically what the purpose is. And we don't want to think that any of these ideas are themselves exactly and absolutely true. They're all flawed. All the views are flawed. Okay, I'm going to read verse 196. The unlimited space of Turyatita, which shines suddenly in all its fullness within the heart of a highly mature aspirant during the state of complete absorption of mind, as if a fresh and previously unknown experience, is the rarely attained and true Shivaloka, which shines by the light of self. So, in the Upanishads, basically, there are said to be three states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And then there's said to be a fourth state, which is Turiya. Okay, this Turiya is beyond all these three states. You could view Turiya a couple of different ways. You could view it as, in some sense, as just the self, period. Or you could view it as a certain kind of special insight. And in a way, that is what's being pointed to here, this insight quality. Because what happens is, just like in the very first verse that I talked about, as clear as a fruit in the palm of your hand, there is a game we're playing here. And the game is, can we get clarity so that things shine as clearly as the fruit in the palm of your hand? So what happens is we use the practices and we attempt to get to a state of profound concentration. And if that state of profound concentration is then sort of graced by God at a certain point, then we either temporarily, permanently have a very profound insight into who we are. That profound insight, which is a, I like to call it, the spacious mind, this insight. We should know it's just an insight. It's not absolute truth, because anything which comes and goes is not absolute truth. We always have to maintain this in mind. But this insight is a kind of sudden seeing into the nature of the I, a sudden seeing into the nature of what you thought you were, and its sort of illusory quality becomes clear for a moment. And so in that moment, there is a reversal of, you might say, of background and foreground in a way. As one experience of it. There may be many such experiences like that. But that experience, which is the aim in the sense of the concentration of the practice, is what Maharshi says is the true, kingdom of God, basically. So what happens is, through a great deal of practice and concentration, such states may occur. If they occur temporarily, if they occur in a way, if they can be said to occur at all, occurrence means start, and starting means ending, and that makes it temporary. But still, the idea is they are profound destroyers of attachment, basically, when such states occur. And ultimately, such a state of that kind of profound concentration, graced by God, is what will lead to the so-called end of the search. Because there is a kind of end of the search, even though the end of the search is there is no search. So it's a snake eating its own tail. But nevertheless, we have to maintain this in mind. But nevertheless, there is an end to the search. Effort does not go on forever. It goes on up to a certain point, and then it ends. So at that ending is marked in this way. It's marked by the unlimited space of Gurugapita, because it shines that, Maharshi likes to use this language of the I and the I-I, as marking the difference between your usual sense of self and a sudden spaciousness which shows your usual sense of self to be false, at least for a moment. And again, I mentioned yesterday how, during certain, I think I mentioned yesterday, during certain profoundly absorbing activities, one can have a sense of the activity happening without a sense of doership, right? It's just happening by itself. And it almost feels like an out-of-body experience. And so that is a kind of, you might say, it's kind of very like limited domain specific version of what's being talked about here. But we want to get to this via self-inquiry and surrender, because we're trying to target, we're not trying to just be very good at acting or music or some particular, activity. We're trying to show the falsity of what we think we are, basically. Another way I want to explain this is, I think I was using an analogy yesterday of a reflection in a lake. So a lake could reflect many things, many faraway things and nearby things. And so the faraway things might include trees and mountains and clouds and all that sort of stuff. And the nearby stuff might include like your face. So through the practice, initially our attention is distributed on many, many different things. And through the practice, we concentrate our attention. Let's say if we're doing self-inquiry, we're concentrating on who am I, right? Or if we're doing surrender, we're concentrating on ignoring everything. In that process, we are bringing our attention inward from many things to one thing. When that one thing that we are focusing on becomes intensely focused, that concentration becomes profound. What it means is, effectively, we're looking at our face in the water. But that's not sufficient. That might be equivalent to a state of peace. A further step has to be taken, which we can't compel. We can't make it happen. We just keep trying. And that is the leap out of the water to recognize this is a reflection of me. So that ultimately, and so if that happens for a moment, it's a glimpse of this space of Turyatita. If it happens permanently, it's the end of the search. But the point is, we're doing all this work so that we can have a shiny mirror into which we can look and say, oh, this is me. Once that recognition is there, you no longer need the mirror to remind you over and over again that this is me. I don't have to keep looking in the mirror. Oh yeah, this is me, this is me, this is me. Once it's sunk in sufficiently, the mirror is no longer required. And that's the ultimate point that we're trying to go for in our little game of the search. Any questions so far?
Yeah, but you mentioned about the story 5 minutes back, right? Somebody's writing a character.
Yes, yes.
But when you say like when we are seeing the mirror and
Yes.
that's me,
Yes.
that can be also an illusion.
Of
correct?
course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In the end, everything's part of the illusion. So the whole search is an illusion. Yeah. But that is, ironically, that realization is what this mirror thing is going to reveal. So that this is why ultimately, right, we're rendered speechless.
So the end of the sense is also like kind of meaningless in that case, correct?
Yeah, in a sense it is. It's meaningful right now because people want the truth and they want to get out of suffering. But in the end, is the self bothered? Self is never bothered. Self is not, the true self, meaning you right now in reality, are not actually bound right now. Right now, you're not bound. Right now, you're not suffering, you're not ignorant, and you're not having a problem, really. This is entirely fictional from start to end. But it feels like it isn't. So to you, to whom it feels like it is real, you must strive. But who you actually are is never affected. Not currently, never, 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 not for one instant. So it's funny in a way, it's a kind of joke, right? It's the cosmic joke, actually.
Can you elaborate on the glimpse that you talked about?
Yeah, so the glimpse is, it'll become obvious if that happens, right? But and different people experience it different ways, but there is like, what you might call like an aha moment.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And different traditions, it's called different things. Like, for example, in Buddhism, it could be called like Satori, it could be called Kensho, right? Sudden insight in the nature of being, right? You're like, oh, this is what it's all about. That's still a thought.
Nirvana.
It's a kind of, Nirvana, it's a thought of nirvana, you might say. It's a sudden shift in perspective. It's a perspectival shift where the usual veil of forgetfulness that seems to cover the self is temporarily or permanently cut, basically.
Gone.
Yeah, exactly. And in that moment, you're like, oh, I get it. And then, if the attachments are strong enough, you fall back and you have to do it again. But the second time around, it's a little bit easier, perhaps, and on and on and on it goes. But if the attachments are weak enough, then it will not be a glimpse at all. It will just be the truth, period. Because the reality is, anything which has a beginning has an end, including any insight you have. Any insight about the self is a thought, because it has a beginning, therefore it has an end. Any enlightenment experience is a thought, because it has a beginning, therefore it must have an end. So it's a thought. So there is something which is uncapturable, right? Because you could say, what exactly is different at the end of the search? That question will itself have to be drowned, right? Because when you look into that question, mind goes silent. That question is itself like a flawed question in a way. That's what's going to be revealed. That question seems meaningful, but it isn't. Okay, verse 209. When the fictitious ego, whose accumulated tendencies from the beginningless past, is burnt by the fire of jnana, that reality which alone remains within is a sacred vibhuti. This you should know. So, of course, vibhuti is a sacred ash. I like this. I like this verse for a couple of reasons. One is, I want to mention a couple of things, right? Talking about the fictitious ego, I was just talking about fiction, right? The ego itself is fictional. Ego itself is fictional. The ego is the ego is, we should understand what the ego is. It's a, people use the word in many, many different ways. And that itself is a kind of pointer to what it is, because what the ego is fundamentally like confusion. Basically, it's confusion. As you try to examine it, it changes form, and it is of the nature of like mental confusion ultimately. So people use it like all kinds of ways. They mean it to mean like arrogance, or they mean to mean a certain part of the mind. And ultimately, you're driving, as we drive in self-inquiry towards it, seems to be like, oh, I'm the witness. And in some way, ego is all of these things. But in the end, what ego really is it's a profound confusion. It's a profound confusion, which of the variety which can't be understood. It can't be understood because understanding itself flows out of it. It, as the base of confusion, generates all the ideas about understanding. So understanding cannot grasp how it works. And self-inquiry does not allow the mind to grasp how the ego works. What it does is it like disappears the base by which the ego operates. The ego operates through mental movement based on attachments. If you take away its supports, the ego can't function in that same way, basically. But what ego actually is, that very question dissolves the ego. So it can't be exactly answered in words what precisely it is. It's a hovering site of profound mental confusion, which hides the self and creates this very compelling illusion of I am this limited entity, essentially. But the whole thing is fictional. It's so fictional, again, that when it is seen through, it will be seen that it was never there to be seen through. It was never there to be seen, just like ignorance itself. And that's why, again, it's also mentioned, right? It's accumulated tendencies from the beginningless past. So why beginningless? I was trying to point to this with my analogy of the reader of the book being a character in a second book, and the reader of that book being a character in a third book. Thoughts create, how should I put it? There's an infinite series of connections, basically. There's an infinite series of connections. Those connections seem to be this shadowy network that go on and on and on and on and on. It's that sense which gives a seeming solidity to your sense of individuality. Time is just a thought. So it's all you have to do is to think 10 million years ago, and now you've created, in a sense, 10 million years. That's the way the ego works. Ego creates like implications. It implies things. It's as if it's suggesting things that go on and on and on and on and on, and you can never find the end of it, but it's always suggests there's more. So at the same time, if you actually investigate it at the weak point, see, it's like two mirrors like facing each other and reflecting, creating a seeming infinity. But all you have to do is turn one of the mirrors enough, and the entire infinity disappears all at once. If you try to remove the mirrors one by one, in their reflections, you'll never get to the end of it. So similarly, if you try to quiet the mind, we do try to quiet the mind, but note that if you try to stop all the mind's movements one by one, you'll never get to the end of it. You can never get to the end of it. You can never get to the end of it because it's not real. It's the thought. It's thought of it. It's thought of endless progression. So yeah, that's kind of some element of how the ego works. I like this paragraph as well because it mentions vibhuti and the sacred ash. And I want to mention that there is, there are many pointers in the texts to, how should I put it? Subtle feelings. There are kind of subtle feelings, really. In the end, there's subtle feelings of what the mind in its purity feels like. If you're moving towards that sense of peace, which again, it's not the end in itself, but to the extent that your mind is becoming quieter and more peaceful, to the extent that it is touching that state of turyatita that was mentioned earlier, it gives a kind of suggestion of the same kind of holiness that you get in a temple, for example, right? We should know this is just a feeling. It's not the self exactly, but it's a kind of hint. It's a kind of sign, just to know.
So that the one mirror removal, that is the ego that you have to remove. That out of the two mirror, you said remove one mirror, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the mirrors are basically facing each other. Are the that's the functioning of ego. Basically, the ego is generating. Ego is generating that. If you want to move one of the mirrors, the way you have to do it is by searching out the sense of I, basically. And you can move one of the mirrors, basically, or surrendering sufficiently, which is the same thing, really, in the end. Yeah. So verse 241, whatever thought may rise, not to let it live or grow, but to destroy it then and there without the least slackness, by merging it back into its source, is powerful and intense vairagya. So vairagya means detachment. So he's saying what detachment really consists of is to be extremely, extremely watchful, alert, and vigilant, and watch your mind at all times. And anytime the slightest thought arises, to feed it into the machinery of practice. Either inquiry by saying, well, who's experiencing this thought? Or surrender by saying, this thought has nothing to do with me, and I'm not going to react to it. And that's what it means to merge it back into its source. Because as you do this, it goes back into that silence. It goes back into the silence. I agree. I've said before, silence is not the end. What happens is that silence will, as you do the practice, will become deeper and deeper and will lead you into the goal, which is beyond even silence, actually. But that's the practice. Practice is intense hypervigilance, and constantly redirecting your mind away from thoughts. And when I say thoughts, it means any external focus of attention, any perception, any feeling, any imagination, any dream. Those are all thoughts. Anything which has a beginning and an end, anything which has a boundary or limitation, those are all thoughts. They're all thoughts. All of those things are thoughts. So to continuously be incredibly watchful. That's the goal. And that will come with time. I mean, it's not going to be perfect immediately, but as you do it, to recognize that's the goal. To set that intention, if you're a seeker, that's the goal. That's what you're trying to do.
So when we put this to practice, I think we discussed this yesterday a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's say, how do we dynamically do this, and then what happens? What are the consequences?
Yes.
Maybe if you can give some practical suggestions. So, for example, in this talk, let's say I'm listening to you.
Yes.
How do I practice?
Yes. Practice exactly like this.
While listening to you.
So don't worry about listening to me.
Okay.
Practice. And whatever listening needs to happen will happen. That's always the case. So, because anytime there's any question really of anything, this is why, self-inquiry and surrender are the basically like universal solutions to everything in life, because anything that arises as a problem of any kind is always going to be in the form of a thought. And all you have to do with that thought is feed it into the practice. So when you say, for example, how should I listen to this talk? And who's having that thought? Who's having that thought? That's it. Or ignore it. Or ignore it. That's all you have to do. So there's no requirement to listen to this talk, to this talk at all. Whether this talk is listened to or not, your attitude should be, that's none of my business. What's my business is the practice. That's it. Everything else will take care of itself or not take care of itself as it wishes. It's not my business. And this on a second-to-second basis. I want to say, I keep talking about attachments. And people would like to think, I can just decide to give up my attachments. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. So what happens is attachments to various parts of your identity and whatnot manifest themselves in the moment, in situations, through the medium of thought. Like a thought occurs in the moment about your children or about your job or whatever vacation you want to take or whatever it is, right? In that moment, the attachment gives rise to that thought. In that moment, you must catch that thought and subject it to inquiry or surrender. That's how you weaken the underlying attachment. That's the only way to weaken the underlying attachment, really. There are other ways, maybe like therapy to some extent, but that's a different way. That's a different method. So from the spiritual angle, we can't just give up the whole thing. We don't have the power to. We have to do it as they manifest in situations in real time.
But I think that sadhana you mentioned, I think that will increase the length of the time where we can capture this moment of the attachment awareness.
Yes, exactly. As you do the sadhana, you will automatically start to notice, as you set the intention to do it all the time, you're going to start noticing how much of the time you're not doing it. And you're all going to start to notice in what situations you're not doing it. And that's going to show you the structure of your attachments. Oh, it's difficult with these people. These people really, make me angry or whatever, or I really care about this. And I find myself unable to do the practice in this situation, right? As you set the intention to do it all the time, you start to see how much of the time you're not doing it. And then you start to see where and when you're not doing it. And as you start to notice that, you can start to anticipate in advance, these situations are more difficult. And if you start to anticipate them, then you can prepare yourself extra hard to not be distracted in those situations. And then those situations weaken in their influence, and on it goes.
It doesn't come in. Yeah, right. So every little thing and you get disturbed.
Yes, exactly. Right. Well, that's what happens to a lot of people. But even a slight touch of this will start to open up something.
No rain, you worry, everything is dry. Rain, there's flooding, and the trees start coming down, and the houses start leaking.
Yes.
Philosophy.
Infinite series of. I'm just sorry. Look at the time really fast. Make sure
8:50.
it's 8:50. Okay, great. So let's go to the next verse. We've got 10 more minutes. Okay, so if by the wonderful, this is 242 by the way, if by the wonderful weapon of self-inquiry you would continue destroying one by one all the innumerable foes, the vasanas rising in the form of thought, as and when each of them comes out of the fort, chittam, the enemy's fort will finally be in your hands. So the vasanas are, of course, are tendencies. You just say that's the attachments, the same thing, and chittam is, you might view it as like just the mind. It's another word for the mind, basically. So Maharishi here analogizes that there's the kind of fort that you're trying to attack, and this fort is full of your tendencies. You have to keep the practice going until one by one these tendencies arise in real life, in situations, and you kind of shoot them down through inquiry or through surrender. So it's all about the practice. It's all about the practice. If you want self-knowledge. It is all about the intensity of your looking inward through inquiry or surrender. Everything else, all the scriptures, all the views, all the philosophy, it's all just to motivate you to look inwards continuously look inwards all the time, continuously look inwards. That is the goal. And that will lead you to your own direct experience, which cannot be put into words. Everything else is secondary to that. It's just an aid to that.
Yeah, even all the Upanishads also.
All the Upanishads, absolutely. 243 says, if the world that is seen is found to be not apart from the seer, that is jnana. Vairagya is clinging fast to self and rejecting this world with detachment, viewing it as merely void. So vairagya again is, another word for detachment. Jnana is knowledge. And so she says, if the world that is seen is found to be not apart from the seer. So what it's saying is, right now, there is that sense of distinction between me and the not me. That sense of distinction is in some profound sense to be false. In some profound sense, false. You know, in what sense, we'll have to see for ourselves. But when that distinction is seen or felt or experienced in some profound way to be false, that's the knowledge we're looking for. And then he gives a definition of essentially what I consider surrender, right? So vairagya is clinging fast to self and rejecting this world with attachment, viewing it as merely void, right? So your attitude in surrender is, this is white noise. Everything that's occurring has nothing to do with me, not the slightest bit. And that includes, again, by the way, your own thoughts and feelings. Your own thoughts and feelings are part of that. It's not saying that you can't think or feel certain things. Those are just naturally arising phenomena, just like clouds go in the sky. Similarly, like, okay, you think certain thoughts, you feel certain things. Some of those things may be negative. So what? Irrelevant. As long as you have a certain inner part of yourself which can view those things as irrelevant and keeps noticing them in this hyper vigilant way as irrelevant, so that you don't get drawn into taking them to be true, then you're in the practice and you're detached. And we know that we don't take it to be true when you don't expend what feels like deliberate personal effort towards it. Anything which feels like burdensome effort is a sign that you're taking the world to be real. If you can suspend your sense of any burdensome effort, then in that moment, you're not taking the world to be real. You're effectively ignoring it. And so the idea is to stay in that all the time. And to recognize that you're continuously trying to, the world is continuously trying to fool you. It's continuously trying to trick you into taking it to be true. It's like the Buddha, is said, in his final enlightenment, just before it, I should say, to be sitting under the Bodhi tree, right, for 3 days and 3 nights, right? And Mara, who is said to be the devil, parades a series of temptations before him, right? Temptations and fears, all kinds of things, right? The point being to try to get him up from the tree and like engaged, right? The whole job of the Buddha was to keep viewing it as void. That's what Maharshi says. So that's the notion of surrender there. And again, if you do inquiry instead, the very turning towards I, hunting for it, looking for it, searching for it, that will produce exactly the same effect. Okay, verse 255. If self, the Lord of the soul, did not indisputably reside on the ruggeds. I'm bringing this up because this is a it's a fun topic, I think, and I think it's a confusing topic. I mentioned this briefly yesterday. So he says, if self, the Lord of the soul, did not indisputably reside on the right side of the chest, why do one and all have the habit of touching only that place whenever they say I? I think somebody mentioned this yesterday. Can't remember who. So he's talking about this, right? You say I, tend to say that. You tend to say I here, something like that. So Maharshi likes this idea of the heart. He goes on to clarify it, you see. So he says in verse 261, though the heart is said to be both inside and outside, it truly exists neither inside nor outside, because the appearance of the body, which is the base of the difference inside and outside, is itself a mental conception. So it's a little confusing because what he wants to say is, what he wants to do here is he wants to draw people in to self-inquiry by giving them a kind of hint as to the feeling which should be followed, right? That feeling is like, it feels like I'm kind of here, right? Now, the cardinal rule of self-inquiry is anything that you feel is not you, is not you. You have to say who's aware of that. But still, it's the beginning of the road. Because you kind of have this sense that, yeah, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm kind of here. And if you follow that deeper, right? Like, okay, well, who's aware of this, right? It leads you somewhere. So he's trying to give people a kind of initial anchor for people who can't otherwise have, they're totally rudderless in the self-inquiry process, because you kind of start with this initial feeling. But then if you pursue that feeling, what it turns out is this is not what it seems to be. It seems to be the sort of physical-ish feeling in you, but it's not actually that. The heart is not actually that, because if you look for where am I, you're not going to find yourself here as a feeling here. You're going to find yourself neither inside nor outside. That's what Maharshi says in the next verse. So to understand that, that's a kind of initial, pointer for self-inquiry. And if you follow that road, the heart, the meaning of the heart will go far beyond this initial physical sensation to basically mean the self, essentially. That's what he means by it. So I think this is about 9 now. So I think I will conclude with asking if anyone has any questions.
So you start with this location.
You don't have to start.
So is it as a spatial link or a location?
Yeah, it's the way I see it is, if you feel so inclined to start with that, you can start with that. But you'll immediately have to go beyond it. Yeah, because you have to say who's aware of this, who's aware of this. So it's just a kind of trying to show you that, like, yeah, you kind of do have, you have this sort of sense, you have this sort of feeling, seeming feeling, and then you want to ask who's aware of this feeling. That itself is immediately going to take you deeper. You don't have to start there. It's something I wanted to clarify because Maharishi really likes it. He talks about it, and people are confused by it. So I wanted to sort of clarify the meaning of it.
Akilesh, this morning you mentioned that could.
Oh, sorry,
question.
I can't really hear you. We're going to adjust and make it a little louder. Sorry.
This morning you mentioned you
I
could
think
replace.
No, from that end. Maybe you have to come closer. Is it Sriram?
Yes,
Yeah, you need to come closer. We are not able to hear you much.
I'll try one more time. Otherwise, I'll ask you tomorrow.
என்னோடதுல இருக்குமா?
You mentioned this morning that you could replace the question of who am I with where I am, where am I
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
So,
Exactly.
so done right, should the process of asking the questions result in something similar to the Panchakosha Viveka Vichara, which is from the Annamaya Kosha to the body, the breath, the mind, to the intellect, the bliss core, and then lead you into the internal?
Yeah, it need not follow that sequence in some rigid way, it need not follow that sequence in a rigid way. It might be the case that it goes in that direction, but fundamentally, it could leap, because often people will, there's so many sequences of different people. And many people will be stuck in the body for a long time. In terms of, yeah, it feels like I'm in the body, it feels like I'm in the body. It'll feel like that for a long time. And then maybe they'll go to a concept. They'll start thinking about, they'll start thinking about what they've seen in a scripture or something like that. That's a concept, right? Or they'll have certain questions, or they'll say, I don't know, or they'll say that it's, expansive. All kinds of answers can come up. So I don't want to say that it's going to follow any rigid sequence necessarily. It just depends. It could follow that sequence.
You're saying you should not retrofit the Panchakosha on top
No.
of this and do it with conviction.
Yeah, you shouldn't try to impose a pre-written framework to say that I have to go through this sequence. Oh yeah, I'm not this, then I'm not that. All these kinds of like things that are written in the scriptures, like, that do say, I'm not the body and I'm not the mind and I'm not the intellect and I'm not this and I'm not that, are aids. That's all aids, are background information. But the actual experience of inquiry is to follow what feels like your experience of your being the experiencer. Like, where is the experience?
Just follow it organically and see where it leads.
Follow it organically and see where it leads. Exactly.
I think Ramana Maharshi himself is an example of don't need to follow all this.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like us, we start at the
Gen-
Yes.
Yeah,
level,
actually,
but people like him start directly like
Exactly.
yeah, no boundary,
Exactly.
limitless like that kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Follow it wherever it leads you. Follow I wherever I leads you. Where are you? That's a simple question. You're in contact with it all the time. You're in contact with yourself all the time. You know that you are all the time. Where is that knowledge? What is that knowledge? What is that? Where is that sense coming from? That's simple as that. That's inquiry, period. Sorry? Oh,
Thank you. Done.
any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
maybe like a little bit maybe relevant here, but how you see the teachings of Ramana Maharshi and the Nisargadatta Maharaj in this context?
So, I mean, it depends which teachings you're talking about, but I think one common teaching that, Nisargadatta Maharaj is said to have given, I think, is to stay in the I am. Stay in the I am. So, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What,
So-
what Maharaj? Which Maharaj?
Nisargadatta Maharaj.
Ah.
Yeah. So this staying in the I am teaching is the way I would see it is it's fine and it will ultimately lead to the same place. I prefer not to think of it that way because, see, what does it mean to stay in the I am? That's a bit contradictory right there. What you think is happening when you're staying in the I am is that you are residing in yourself, but you're actually not. What you're doing is you are residing, meaning you are focusing on a feeling, a subtle feeling that you have labeled I am. That's all. Now, why will that still lead you to the same place? Because if you follow that all the time, it will still concentrate your mind. And if you keep thinking I am, eventually when the mind concentrates, it'll become like a false bottom in a drawer, and it'll fall. It'll turn out to be like nothing. So it'll drop you into the same thing ultimately. But I would prefer, for clarity's sake, to recognize that when you think you're residing in the I am, you aren't, because I am is what seems to be residing. See, like I'm focusing on I am. No. The one who's the focuser, that's I am. This thing is something else that I just think is I am. Yeah, and that's the whole trick of the ego, right? It keeps labeling something else, as I, basically. It mistakes object for subject, basically.
Don't focus outside,
Inside. So in a question that, because that's the mind. The problem is the mind is going to objectify everything. That's the whole issue, right? So it's looking for I, but it's looking for I always out there, always, because it can't conceive of what it means to look actually what it actually is. That would dismantle itself in the process. So it's like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and if all you have is a mind, everything looks like a mental object. But the real nature of ego is not like that exactly. The real nature of ego is it's on the border. It's on the border, of mind and non-mind, basically.
Yeah, so that the mind that's doing the inquiry never really finds the I, right? It's not the one that's finding the I.
Correct. Exactly.
That's
That's exactly right. Yes.
Very
Yes.
So it's doing the inquiry, it's never going to find.
Bhagavan says it's like using a needle to take the thing out.
Yeah. Correct. Exactly. That's right. The mind attacks the mind in some sense, sees through the mind. I mean, you could say, look, does the mind see? Does the mind not see? yes and no, it really can
Right.
say, right? I like to say the mind, in some sense, perceives its limit. And in the process of perceiving its limit, it then immediately has intuition, there's something beyond that, right? The intuition of the beyond, right? Which it can't see, it can't conceive, but somehow it is impressed upon it, that this is the case.
It's like a thief pretending to be a police and trying to catch the thief.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's ultimately that's the difficulty with the mind looking for I. Yeah. But but God's grace ultimately intervenes.
When you said this is imposed upon the mind, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, what I mean to say is
The
that
mind gets an insight, you say.
the mind gets an insight, but the problem is the nature of the insight is technically speaking, we're talking about something which is about the limits of the mind to comprehend. The point is the insight is about the limitations of the mind. So in the mind, like in that moment, it's like, oh my God, I am limited. I thought I could see everything, but actually I myself am seen. I am seen by something else, right? So when it gets that, it can't completely grasp what that something else might be, but it's like, nevertheless, something is impressed upon it. There is a, it's the shadow of the divine that falls on it. It can't know it exactly, but it does know it in a sense. It knows it as its own limitation.
That's where the surrender comes in, though, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you have, eventually the surrender only gets you.
Yeah,
You-
correct.
Mind cannot figure
Yeah,
it out.
exactly.
So
Yes.
Bhagavan says that as you go inner and inner, the inner self will suck you
Yeah,
in
yeah, exactly.
and then take you in.
Yes,
right?
yes, exactly. That's right.
That's a journey.
Hmm?
That's a journey of life.
No, in in some talk he has stated that, more you practice, you reach a stage where, then beyond that you cannot penetrate.
Yeah.
Only the penetration force comes from inside.
Ah,
So the God's grace will pull you in
Yeah.
to become.
Correct. Exactly right. Any other questions? All right, then I think we'll call it for tonight.
Yeah.
See you all
Thank you so
tomorrow.
much.
Yeah, see you all tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, Mahakalesh temple.
You.
And this evening, there's nothing, right? 7 o'clock. Yeah. Okay.
Tomorrow morning meditation.
Morning meditation is there. There is